CBC News Network on demand.
Tonight's first order of business, a new approach to shaking up public company governance in Canada, letting big shareholders have a bigger say in who sits in the corporate boardroom. It's one that's already in place in the U.S., and advocates of shareholder rights think this is the real route to democracy for investors. Welcome to The Exchange on CBC News Network. They're often accused of being overly clubby corporate boards filled with like-minded thinkers who continually nominate peers to their ranks. We've seen initiatives to get more women on boards, moves to give shareholders say on executive pay, but a push to give major shareholders a role in just who gets nominated to a company's corporate board may be the biggest change maker yet. The Canadian Coalition for Good Governance wants Industry Canada to amend the Canada Business Corporations Act so shareholders that have at least 3% of a company's shares can choose 20% of the nominees to a company's board of directors. At companies with a market cap of less than $1 billion, the minimum share ownership threshold would be 5%. It's known as PROXY ACCESS, and the CCGC says it could be put in place voluntarily. South of the border, McDonald's and Monsanto are among the high-profile companies to institute PROXY ACCESS. In Canada, no companies have chosen the PROXY ACCESS route yet. In the U.S., the former head of the Securities and Exchange Commission cited PROXY ACCESS reforms as one of her top priorities several years ago, but that was defeated in a court of appeals. Mary Jo White, the current head of the SEC, says the shareholder proposals process is working very effectively, and she has no intention of pursuing PROXY ACCESS rules. Richard Leblanc is an associate prof at York University. Great to have you here.
I agree.
So what I find fascinating about this is we have this notion that share ownership is a form of democracy, that we should be able to, because we are theoretically owners of a company, have a say about things that happen on the company. It doesn't work very well so far, does it?
No, it's not really democracy. It's kind of a dictatorship because directors select themselves, and shareholders, for the most part, don't communicate with directors. They don't select directors. They don't have the power to remove directors. So what the coalition is saying, and I think it's reasonable and it's a modest proposal, if we have 3% of the total market cap, we should be able to have a say in terms of 1 or 2 directors and put them up for election.
So the things that investors purport to want to have a say on, pay is a big one. It's been a hot button issue. We've actually seen a couple of high profile cases in Canada where there had been surprising votes against a proposed pay structure for instance, the CEO. These are non-binding, but it's a step in a new direction, because for many years you heard investors fulminate about pay and then get to the meeting and not vote against it. Do you think this kind of change, this governance change, would make more of a difference, that would help would that director then on that board have a voice in pay that would make a difference?
Yes. This is the corporate governance game changer, PROXY ACCESS. Say on pay, majority voting, other initiatives over the last couple of years has been regarded as window dressing. So at the end of the day, investors want to be able to nominate their slate of directors and not be faced with 10 directors with an up or down vote to select certain directors. So it's reasonable. Corporate directors, management will push back, I predict, very hard. In the U.S., the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, fought this tooth and nail. So this battle that started in America is going to come to Canada, but I think it's long overdue, and it's a debate worth having.
We did, though, just cite a couple of companies in the U.S. that voluntarily do it, even though there are high-profile folks at the SEC saying we don't want this to be a matter of law. When it's voluntary, companies do it. Why do they choose it when it can be? You can imagine it being a nuisance for them.
Yeah, and it's a nuisance. I think the Institute of Corporate Directors said it was a fad. Why would they do it voluntarily? Because it's the right thing to do. Citibank has done it. Bank of America has done it. General Electric has done it. If 1 or 2 Canadian banks do it and a couple of energy companies, this will lead the way for other companies. This is the right thing to do in terms of corporate governance. The other thing is regulation. Industry Canada is looking at PROXY ACCESS as well. So regulators might ultimately regulate this, and we see this in a number of areas where there's not enough progress on a voluntary basis. Diversity, for example, on boards of directors. So regulators could step in, and in one fell swoop, they could grant PROXY ACCESS. So it's incumbent upon directors to recognize shareholders' concerns and volunteer.
Shareholders, investors, often have different kind of time frames, interests than the managers of a company, and that can be for better or worse. But one imagines that managers will often have a longer-term view, understand why an investment will pay off over 10 years instead of one, than investors. Do we run a danger of having a misalignment of interests if investors who own 3% of a company now have, two of the directors on the slate?
There's not necessarily a misalignment, and shareholders are not necessarily short-term, and management is not necessarily long-term. Shareholders, the evidence shows, are 5, 6, 7-year holders. Management, 90% of management pay a short-term, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. So there is a bit of,
so it's the opposite.
And also there's heterogeneity among shareholders, and I think that can be captured. If you've got a group of shareholders that own up to 3%, having their ability to propose certain directors as opposed to being told these are the directors up for election, I think is fairly progressive.
If an owner of 3% of a company then sells the stake, do we know what happens in that event? I
believe as long as the director's on the board, according to the proposal, they have to retain ownership. And for the most part, CCGG is a long-term investor. Mm-hmm. In fact, they can't sell quite readily. So they're in it for the long game.
So tell me, in your view, whom the director should serve. Is the director there to serve management? Are they there to serve shareholders?
That's the issue.
Or are they finding some middle ground?
The directors are there to serve shareholders. They are there to represent shareholder interests, not management's interests. And right now, directors either select themselves or are selected by managers. And if directors truly are accountable to shareholders, shareholders should be able to select and fire them. So this proposal moves it in that direction, that true shareholder accountability. So management's accountable to the board's accountable to shareholders.
So it wouldn't just change the fact that there are a couple of new directors on the board, it might change the whole tone of the director relationship.
And that's exactly right, Amanda. Exactly right, yes.
We'll leave it there. Thanks, Richard.
Terrific.
Richard Leblanc is an associate prof at York University.